Hello, everyone watching this. In this presentation, I will discuss some properties of ventilation and stirring in the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, or the ACC. I'm sure most people are aware of this, but just as a refresher, the ACC is the largest current in the ocean and circumnavigates the Southern Ocean. It is a region where deep isocyclones rise to the surface, and this results in two things. First, we get an adiabatic pathway connecting the surface to the deep ocean. And secondly, the available potential energy stored in the system gets released by instabilities like baroclinic instability and generates a vigorous eddy field. This eddy field, in combination with adiabatic pathway, makes the ACC a region where a large part of the ocean ventilation happens. So of course, there's a lot of interest and value in understanding the properties of stirring in the ACC. So now that we have this overview, let's focus on a specific region of the ACC for this talk. The region we will focus on is one of the regions where the ACC interacts with topography in the Indo-Atlantic Ocean. Here, I'm showing a map of bathymetry in this region, and the black lines are approximate locations of where a few of the ACC firms are. Now, as the ACC goes over the Southwest Indian Ridge, marked as SWIR over here, it meanders and generates a lot of activity. The signature of this activity can be seen in this output from a high resolution model for this region. I just want to point out here that our high resolution models are getting really good and can often give us a visual impression that we are simulating everything there is. But a healthy dose of skepticism is always required. So what you're seeing here are temperature on a particular isopycnal in this region. This is one isopycnal that rises from about 1,000 meters on the northern side to about 100 meters on the southern side. And the vigorous eddy field can be seen as these eddies and sort of variability that you see in this map. You should also notice that in this region, the eddies bring cold waters from the south to the north and warm waters along the isopycnal from depth to the south. Now, while this model does show us a big picture view of what is happening, we wanted to sample this region using high resolution observations to confirm what the model sees and also to find out what the models miss. To do so, we carried out a glider campaign in this region, which we called SOGOS, or the Southern Ocean Glider Observations. Two gliders were deployed, as shown over here, on the southern side of the polar front, especially a region where the polar front went over the Southwest Indian Ridge. The glider sampled the region for about 3 months, and during this time, they sampled through the polar front and mostly to the south of it. Notice that the initial part of the glider tracks look very odd, and this is because in this part, we were trying to follow a BGC Argo float released by SOCOM, and also the currents were also because the currents were so strong that they vectored the glider around. In the second half of the sampling, we came out of the strong currents and we could conduct more straight sections, as you can see over here. So before we get into some metrics, let's see some glider sections. So here in the middle is a temperature section that one of the gliders observed along its track. In this region, the density is primarily governed by salinity, and so temperature behaves roughly like a passive tracer. The top row shows sea surface height maps over 3 weeks. Over 3-week periods from 4 different segments where the glider was sampling. The most rapid color changes over here represent roughly the location of where the polar front was during this time. So we see that in the initial 1 month or so, the glider often sampled at the edge of the polar front. And these also happen to be times when we observe these very large temperature anomalies in the temperature sections, essentially suggesting that we are sampling filaments where the cold water could be drawn in from the surface to depth. And just as a reminder, let me step back to show you that the filaments that we're observing are likely filaments like this one that we see over here that are moving from the southern side or closer to the surface into the interior. Further confirmation that these are actually signatures of waters that have moved in from the surface can be taken from sections of AOU, or apparent oxygen utilization, where low values mean that the oxygen is higher or the waters are more oxygenated in this region. And these are usually waters that would have originated at the surface. And actually, a very nice discussion of this can be found in this paper by Dhruv et al. 2021 that just appeared last year. And in fact, Lily, who wrote this paper, has a talk that she's giving at this meeting where she looks at such signatures in the whole of the Southern Ocean. So in the main part of this talk, we will be quantifying the structures that we see in the glider sections and use them to learn about the dynamics and kinematics of the flow. The method of choice for this talk will be Spectra, and in the paper that will eventually come out about this work, we will also use structure functions. So here's a quick refresher of how Spectra can be used to quantify scales. So what we do is break up some signal into modes, and then each mode is assigned a length scale or a time scale that corresponds to the wavelength or frequency. The sum of variance of each mode is equal to the total variance or energy, which is why we consider it to be the decomposition of the variance into scales. So here's an example to solidify this and what will follow. Here's a section of density observed by one of the gliders. Now we can take the density time series at a couple of depths, for example, 400 meters and 180 meters. The first thing we see clearly now is how there are different scales present in the density heaving. At 400 meters, there are almost two distinct scales. There are the large eddies, which go up and down every 10 to 15 days. And there's the very small scale perturbation that add a sort of roughness. While at 180 meters, there's less of the separation, and the variance seems to be present at a lot of scales. Now, if you look at the power spectrum, we see that it is flat and white at the smallest frequencies, or scales larger than about 10 days for both depths. At 400 meters, where there's a distinct large and small scales, the spectra falls off quite rapidly for frequencies smaller than 10 days. Overlaid on this are peaks that are present at scales of 12 to 15 hours, which correspond to the tidal and inertial frequencies in this region. In contrast, at 180 meters, the spectra falls off less rapidly. And again, there are the tidal and inertial peaks that are present. So to quantify how rapidly the spectra falls off, we fit and estimate the slope of this drop-off range while avoiding the tidal and inertial peaks. And this gives us a sense of the relative amplitude of variance at different scales. Now, if the slope is steep, something like -3, the variance drops off rapidly and the field is smooth and mostly composed of large scales. While if the slope is shallow, something like -2 or -1, we will call the field as being relatively rough or having relatively high variance at smaller scales, as we can also see in this plot. One thing to mention here is that since the glider is moving around in space, this frequency spectrum has some spatial signal aliased into it. Also, going forward, we will be considering the wave number spectra, which we calculated only over the part of the glider section where the track was relatively straight, so that it corresponds to length scales of the flow. But even there is some temporal aliasing that is potentially going on. Regardless, these metrics do provide us a nice avenue to study the properties of the fields. Now let's look at a more comprehensive picture of what density structure looks like. So here we are plotting the spectra at multiple depths simultaneously and displaying them as a contour plot. Also, we plot the slope of the power law that we are going to obtain by fitting over the range of frequencies between a day and 10 days. Now some patterns start to emerge. So the mixed layer has this interesting pattern where the variance at small scales is relatively enhanced near the surface and at the base of the mixed layer, with a smoother field in the middle of the mixed layer. This happens to be a signature of what mixed layer instabilities, which are composed of eddy waves at the two boundaries, would look like. Second, we see that in the interior, there are these depth coherent peaks that corresponds to frequencies of semi-diurnal tides and inertial oscillations, and these decay away from the base of the mixed layer. Lastly, we see that the subinertial part of the signal is quite smooth or very similar to QG dynamics at depths greater than 400 meters, where the slope becomes close to -3, indicating that the sharp density fronts are not forming in the interior, and also that the submesoscale perturbations can penetrate quite deep, up to about 200 meters below the base of the mixer, as seen as higher values of slope, some closer to -2 or -2.5. Now let's look at the wave number spectrum as a function of depth, which, as I mentioned before, has been considered only for the part of the glider section that is relatively straight. So that is less data, and that is why this is a little more noisy. So again, we see small scale variability enhanced at the surface and base of the mixed layer, representing signatures of mixed layer instability. And in the interior, we see a slope of about -2, which actually agrees with what we would expect from the GM spectrum of waves. Essentially pointing out that in the interior, the waves and the balanced motions are overlapping in wave number space. Likely the waves are a little stronger, and we cannot distinguish them as easily as we could in the frequency spectrum. Next, we will focus on the stirring that is taking place in this region in response to the flow whose signatures in density we just discussed. For this part, we will focus mainly on the region that is deeper than the mixed layer. This is where the motions are primarily adiabatic or along isopycnals. So what we do is we do a coordinate transformation to density, which removes the signatures associated with isopycnal heaving. And here we are showing the sections as a function of the corresponding mean isopycnal depth. In the top panel, we are plotting a section of SPICE as a function of along glider track distance. For those who do not know what SPICE is, here it is simplest to think of it as a temperature anomalies observed along the isopycnals, and just this value has been rescaled. So first, there's a lot of lateral structure, presumably formed by lateral interleaving of water masses by the strong eddy field of the ACC. The strength of these anomalies is stronger in the first part, which is a region where the eddy activity is also relatively strong. Second, these stronger anomalies are seen over, these anomalies are seen over the entire depth of the section, signifying that the eddies are quite low mode, and also that there are strong gradients present at depth in the tracers that can be stirred. But in addition to this depth coherence, we also see signals of vertical structure. Interleaving, for example, here, interleaving that is aligned with isopycnals in some places, and that also goes across isopycnals in some other places. And to see this layering more easily, we can use the curvature of spicing depth as a metric, which shows the presence of, where the banded structures show the presence of layering. And essentially we see layering wherever we look. Some of these are aligned with isopycnals, for example, over here. And then there are others that slant across them. Some dramatic examples are present over here. The slanting anomalies that we are seeing are likely structures of the role that the vertical shear is playing in twisting tracer filaments and creating three-dimensional structures. To understand how this layering and this complexity can form easily in a really simple flow, I like this schematic from Yeager et al. In 2020, where they show that a simple eddy with shear, for example, over here, can roll up a vertically unchanging lateral gradient over here across as time goes on into these layers that are present across isopycnals, essentially producing some structure that looks like candy cane. It is important to realize that in this process, the variance is getting cascaded to smaller and smaller vertical scales, where it can get consumed by diffusive processes resulting from 3D mixing, which will be the eventual decay to irreversible mixing. Actually, in these simple models like the QG model, we have some expectations about the statistics of the structures that will form. In fact, I want to quickly mention that if we estimate the aspect ratio of the layering that we observe over here or over here, we find, which is shown over here as this blue line, we find that it is about 50 times larger than the ratio of N over F, or the ratio of stratification to the Coriolis frequency. And that is N over F would be the ratio that would have been predicted by QG. And so what this physically suggests is that the vertical shear is stronger than what QG dynamics alone would predict. And that is resulting in structures that are much flatter than what we would have seen in a QG model. Next, I will discuss what the structures look like in terms of spectra in this session. Here are some wave number spectra to quantify the structure of spice. So let's first look at the top row, where the horizontal along isopycnal spectra are presented. Noting that this is from part of the glider section that was relatively straight. In the first column, I'm plotting the spectra at a couple of different isopycnal, over a couple of different isopycnal ranges, and the spectra have been multiplied by k squared. So a flat range like this indicates that this actual spectral power law is k to the minus 2. What we see from scales of about 100 kilometers, which is basically the largest scales that we can resolve from our sections, down to the smallest scales of about 5 kilometers, the spectra follows a power law of k to the minus 2. And after that, this drop-off is essentially an artifact of interpolation. In the next panel, I'm showing the spectra as at different isopycnals. And in the final panel, the slope of the spectra in the 100 kilometer to 5 kilometer range has been plotted, showing that the slope is about minus 2 over most of the isopycnals. So the k to the minus 2 spectra indicates that the tracer field along isopycnals is smoother than what we would expect from QG dynamics, and suggests that the cascade to smaller scales in the horizontal is more efficient than what one might expect if only the largest eddies were involved in tracer stirring, or said another way, if the stirring was non-local, in which case we would have seen a k to the minus 1 power law. In the second row, I'm plotting vertical spectra observed by the glider. This is also very interesting and shows two distinct regimes. Over scales larger than 50 meters, or 50 to 100 meters, the slope is about minus 2. And then there's a drastic change in spectral slope at about 50 meters, where the spectra becomes steeper at scales below that. Just as a side note, the vertical resolution of the glider is about 1 to 2 meters. So this tells us two things. First, that up to scales of 50 to 100 meters, tracer spectra are similar to what we have observed in the horizontal spectra. These tracer structures are, this suggests that the tracer structures are isotropic in the vertical and horizontal under a certain stretching applied to the vertical direction. However, the spectral slope is steeper, or meaning that the structures are smoother than what QG would say. Second, at scales that are smaller than 100 meters, the tracer field is very smooth. This might be telling us that the tracer cascade to small scales in the vertical is ending at about 100 meters, likely because of diffusive processes like three-dimensional turbulence that can get triggered by wave breaking and Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities in the interior. And they are likely active up to scales of about 100 meters. So in the end, I would like to conclude with our key discoveries. We sampled the ACC using gliders at relatively high resolutions, about 5 kilometers in the horizontal and about 2 meters in the vertical. The structures observed in the density field suggested the presence of mixed layer instabilities and submesoscales that penetrate as deep as about 400 meters, or about 200 meters below the mixed layer. This was in addition to the expected processes that we were going to see, like tides, waves, and mesoscale eddies. Looking at along isopycnal spice patterns, we saw that tracer filaments were flatter and smoother than what QG would predict, suggesting a more efficient cascade of variance to smaller scales due to flows that are not described by QG dynamics. Also, we see structures in the vertical that suggest that the variance cascade ends in the vertical, ends at about 100 meters, indicating that the scales up to which processes like wave breaking or Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities are active are about 100 meters. Finally, I also want to give a plug for some very exciting work that I've done with my collaborators on quantifying interscale energy transfers at the submesoscales. This will be presented in the session PS01 on Monday afternoon, and you can find the recording online.